but if not, my name is Laura Jaskot. I chair the worship committee here at Broad Street, and I am an advanced lay servant as well. We talked about those classes a little bit earlier, so I have taken some of them. Today I am filling in for Pastor Kim as he and Stephanie are taking advantage of the long weekend to visit their children in Virginia. And this was my week to prepare the liturgy. So we have a team of people that rotate and put together the songs and the prayers and stuff so that Kim can focus on his sermon. And I was preparing the liturgy based on the verses that Betsy read for us before I knew I was going to be preaching. And had I known that Kim was going to take this week off, I probably wouldn't have said, oh, let me sing a song and that kind of thing. So I apologize for being up here so much today. But I do want to ask you all, take note of the prayers and the songs that we sang. Particularly the first song that we sang, the name of it, God is Here, right? And the theme is kind of sanctuary, prepare me to be a sanctuary. Those things all tie together. Whenever you're in a church service, normally the songs and the prayers should tie together with the overarching theme of what's going to be discussed. And those go along with today's theme. Now, I don't get the opportunity to preach often, but I do enjoy preaching because I learn a lot of stuff when I'm preparing for a sermon. My husband will tell you I was up way too late last night for a couple of reasons. One, I was watching college football all day and didn't quite get around to starting this, but also I start reading and I research things and I read all these articles and I find such great information. I think, wow, this is terrific. And then I start writing and I think, wow, this is 3 hours worth of material. So I pared it way down, and hopefully you'll find some of this interesting. Way down, for those of you concerned about the time. Okay, so I do want to thank the internet because that's wonderful, but Pastor Kim did send me some of his thoughts also on how he would approach this particular topic. So I'm going to try to stay in line with what he would have shared with you. So let's start with the historical context of what we read today. Last week, Pastor Kim spoke about Solomon and how he became king after his father David left the throne. And earlier in the book of 1 Kings, David asked Solomon to be sure to walk in God's ways. God came to Solomon and said, if you could have anything at all, what is it you would like? And Solomon said, wisdom. Remember the story from last week? Solomon said wisdom. God was very pleased with this answer, and he granted Solomon wisdom, and Solomon became one of the wisest kings ever to rule. He also gave Solomon a lot of other things because Solomon had asked for wisdom as opposed to riches or honor or glory, and God gave him those things. So as Solomon started his reign, he started a building production. And one of the things that he was building was a temple. And it was the temple that his father David had wanted, and David had prepared Solomon for building this temple. Now today's reading is 1 Kings chapter 8, various verses from there. And 2 chapters before we started reading today, we find out that the temple was completed. I found this fascinating. The temple was completed in the 8th month of the year. But in those first few verses that Betsy read for us today, we hear that the dedication of the temple is taking place in the 7th month of the year. It's kind of interesting, right? There's not a time warp going on there. Really what happened is that Solomon waited 11 months after he finished building the temple before he decided to have it dedicated. And as I was reading, I found there's probably a number of reasons for that. The first of which was that Solomon was trying to make it convenient for people. He wanted a lot of people to be at the dedication of this temple. Well, if you want a lot of people to be somewhere, you try to make it convenient. You don't make it on an inconvenient day or date or time. You make it convenient. And in the 7th month, the Jewish people had gathered in their crops. They were ready to come to Jerusalem anyway because there was the Feast of the Tabernacles. So they were going to be headed to Jerusalem for this feast. But apparently, the following year after the temple was completed was also a jubilee. And I don't know if everyone knows what a jubilee year is. I had heard of it and I knew a little bit about it, but I looked that up as well. And a jubilee year occurred every 50 years. according to Leviticus 25, verses 8 through 13. Observe 7 times 7 years, and on the 10th day of the 7th month, sound the loud trumpet, and make the 50th year holy, and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all of its inhabitants. According to the passage, slaves and prisoners would be freed, debts would be forgiven, and the mercies of God would be particularly manifest. In other words, there would be a great celebration going on anyway, and a very large crowd would be present at the dedication of the temple if Solomon waited until the 7th month of the year following its completion. Solomon wanted this thing to be a grand affair, sort of along the same lines as a Super Bowl parade or an Olympics opening ceremony. This is what he had in mind, this grandiose thing. And he planned it perfectly. Once he had all these people gathered in Jerusalem, the next step was for Solomon to have the priests bring in the Ark of the Covenant into the temple. Only the priests could carry the Ark of the Covenant. Solomon was a king. He was not a priest, so he couldn't pick up the ark and carry it. It had to be carried by priests. During the Jews' wanderings in the desert, the ark was kept in a tabernacle and was carried by priests of the Levite tribe as the people moved from one place to another. It was the most important piece of furniture in the wilderness tabernacle. Tabernacle means tent, place of dwelling, or sanctuary. Remember that for later. Okay, there's 3 definitions: tent, place of dwelling, dwelling place, or sanctuary. It was a sacred place where God chose to meet his people, the Israelites, during the 40 years that they wandered in the desert under Moses' leadership. It was a place where the leaders and the people came together to worship and to offer sacrifices. The tabernacle was first erected in the wilderness exactly 1 year after the Passover, when the Israelites were freed from Egypt. It was a mobile tent with portable furniture, and the people traveled with this and set it up wherever they pitched camp. The tabernacle would be in the center of the camp, and the 12 tribes of Israel would set up their tents around this tabernacle according to the tribe. And the instruction on how to build the tabernacle was first given to Moses in the wilderness, and Moses gave the orders to the Israelites, who built it exactly to God's specifications. This was not a random, let me pitch a tent over here and we're going to call that our tabernacle. God gave very specific instructions about how the thing was to be built, what materials were to be used, the size, the shape, the bars that go across. It's really quite interesting. So God dwelled among the Israelites in the wilderness in this tabernacle. He appeared as a pillar of a cloud over the tabernacle during the day, and a pillar of fire by night. Remember those stories from the early Old Testament? And the Israelites would not set out on any new journey unless the cloud lifted and started off in front of them. If the cloud stayed put, the Israelites stayed put. They wandered in the desert for a lot of years, right? But they followed the cloud. It was an unmistakably powerful visual statement indicating God's presence was among them. They saw the cloud, they felt good about the cloud. Now, there's a lot of other places in the Bible where God manifests himself as a cloud among his people. In Exodus chapter 13, we find that this is the cloud that stood by Israel in the wilderness. In Exodus 16, this is the cloud of glory that God spoke to Israel from. In Exodus 19, 24, and Numbers chapters 19 and 24, and Numbers chapters 11, 12, and 16, this is the cloud from which God met Moses. So God is a cloud, a lot of places in the Bible. This is the cloud that stood by the door of the tabernacle, Exodus 33. And it's the cloud from which God appeared to the high priest in the holy place inside the veil of the temple in Leviticus 16. This is the cloud of Ezekiel's vision, filling the temple of God with the brightness of his glory. It's also the cloud of glory that overshadowed Mary when she conceived Jesus by the power of the Holy Spirit, as discussed or documented in Luke. It's the cloud that is present at the transfiguration of Jesus. It's the cloud of glory that received Jesus into heaven at his ascension, documented in the book of Acts. And both Luke and Revelation indicate that this is the cloud that will display the glory of Jesus Christ when he returns in triumph to the earth. So this is not a one-time, hey, there's a tent with a cloud over it, let's describe this as a dust storm. That is not what this is, because this is a manifestation of God's presence throughout the Bible, both Old and New Testaments. So God's provision of a tabernacle, itself a splendor to behold, this was a pretty big moving tent, not only allowed the people to sense his presence, but also to see their leaders go in and meet with God in a concrete place. One time God met with Moses. Moses went up the mountain, right? Moses was up the mountain for quite a while. What happened to the Israelites while Moses was up the mountain? They strayed. They started worshiping idols. They had those golden snakes. They had all kinds of stuff going on. This was a problem, right? So the Israelites thought God had abandoned them. This allowed God to have a physical place where the Israelites could see, my leaders are going in here to worship God. God was a cloud, a pillar of cloud. God is here. So God isn't up the mountain. God isn't somewhere where we can't see him. God is right here. People needed to see and feel that God was with them. The reminder of the deliverance from Egypt when Solomon built the temple is significant because there was a sense in which this, some 500 years after Exodus, was the culmination of the deliverance out of Egypt. When people had been traveling, wandering, they didn't have a set place, now they're in Jerusalem. This was the culmination of being removed from Egypt. Out of Egypt and into the wilderness, Israel, out of necessity, lived in tents. And the dwelling place of God was a tent, this tabernacle. Now, Solomon built the temple, and the structure representing the dwelling place of God among Israel was a building. It was a place of permanence and security, and Solomon recognized that the completion of the temple was the fulfillment of God's plan, not David's plan, not his own plan, but God's plan. Betsy read that when the priest brought the ark into the temple, a cloud filled the temple. That was a visual sign of God descending there to the temple and saying, I am here, I am present with you in this temple, I will dwell here. This is a cloud of glory, and it is hard to define the glory of God. We could call it the radiant outshining of his character and presence, and here it was manifested as the cloud. But the extreme presence of the glory of God made the normal work of the priests impossible. They could not stay in the innermost sanctuary of the temple with that extreme presence of God. They came out. So we know that God is good. God is love. So why would this intense presence of God and love make the priests feel that they couldn't continue? It seems a little bit counterintuitive. But God is not only goodness and love, he is holy. And the holiness of God made the priests feel that they could not stay in his presence. He was just so different from them. The intense sense of the presence of our holy God is not a warm and fuzzy feeling. Men like Peter, outlined in Luke, Isaiah, and John in Revelation felt stricken in the presence of God. It wasn't because God forced an uncomfortable feeling upon them, but because they simply couldn't be comfortable in the presence of God, sensing the difference between his holiness and their sinfulness. So that's the history. What is the point? God created human beings for the sake of fellowship or communion. From the very beginning of the Bible, we have the story of the Garden of Eden, where God was walking with people in the coolness of the day. And we love that image of communing with God, the mental image. And I wrote this last night. I did not plant anyone in the audience, but I said, think about how often during our summer hymn sing someone requests number 314 in the garden. Right? Everybody loves that song. The chorus gives a sense of peace and belonging to God. And he walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own. That is very powerful and very comforting. And obviously, we sing it very often in the summer. People love the song. They love the words. They love the feeling. It's so important to remember that God is everywhere at all times, and he can be worshipped anywhere, but people generally need spaces where we can worship and commune or meet with God. God has always provided those holy spaces or places for us because we are finite. It is very difficult for people to understand the vastness of God. You can't just stand out in the open and say God is everywhere and around. It's so difficult to comprehend. We can look at a flower or look at a bird and say God created this, but we're looking at one thing at a time. It's hard to just stand there and just take in everything at the same time and say God created all of this. We need specific spaces and places to worship. So throughout the Bible, God gave us those places, and it's hard to understand. There was God as a cloud, but he was also everywhere else at the same time. And even Solomon understood that God was too great to be contained in the temple. He said, God, even my temple, it's so little. It's not big enough for you. Are you going to live here on earth in this? Throughout the Bible, we find these altars, sacred stones, mountaintops, all places where people can go to meet God. Now, God gave Moses very specific instructions on the building of that tabernacle or tent as a place where the Israelites could meet God. 500 years later, Solomon built a fabulous temple and dedicated it to God and to prayer. The ark was brought in, and it was installed with speeches, literally days of speeches, sacrifices. Thousands of animals were sacrificed. We didn't read the verses, but today, a couple of verses after where Betsy stopped, it tells us that 22,000 bulls and 120,000 sheep were sacrificed at the dedication of this temple. This was a big deal. Some of the meat went to God. The rest went to feed the folks that were there for the entire length of the time of this ceremony. And it was dedicated with prayer. Prayer not only for the Israelites, but for foreigners. Did you hear those words that Betsy read? Prayer for foreigners. The foreigners were the Gentiles, because if you weren't Jewish, you were Gentiles. We are Gentiles. Solomon was praying for people like us. This was a very radical idea for his time, and the temple, after this dedication, became the center of Israel's worship. Thinking back to that wilderness tabernacle, God was moving with the people of Israel. In the New Testament, John writes, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us." Remember that the word dwelling is the same as the word tabernacle, right? So we could replace that and say, God came in living flesh to dwell or to tabernacle among his people. And as he walked upon the earth and lived among the Jews, Jesus Christ himself fulfilled the picture of the Old Testament tabernacle that was traveling with the Jews throughout the wilderness. Peter refers to the members of the church as living stones being put together as a holy temple. Jesus is the cornerstone, and we make up the stones that build the temple. And Paul in 1 Corinthians wrote, "Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you?" So we move from the physical temple that Solomon built and God's Spirit inhabited that to each of us being a temple and God's Spirit dwelling in us. Jesus promised that when 2 or 3 are gathered in his name, he would be there in the midst of them. So whenever we meet in Jesus' name, here in church, whether we're having communion, which we will have next week, in nursing homes, in hospitals, at somebody's bedside, God will tabernacle among us. Now I'll close with a verse from Revelation, chapter 21, verse 3. "And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God.'" Amen.